Hey, so this person right here decided that they should make a video comparing Royale to Royal to Kingdom 2. Because apparently if you make a dress-up game, there gotta be a copy of another dress-up game. I am so upset about this. Royale is a dress-up game. Royal to Kingdom 2 is also a dress-up game, but they're nothing alike. They're just dress-up games. There's nothing the same about them, but so many people are calling them copies. And I am so upset about this. This person's even calling Royal to Kingdom 2 the new Royale game, and it is not. They are separate dress-up games. I'm so upset about this. They're clearly separate dress-up games, but people are comparing them to each other. This is not fair. This is not fair for Royal to Kingdom 2. They are such a great dress-up game, but they keep getting compared to Royale. They're just dress-up games. Like, that's the only thing they have in common is they're dress-up games. It annoys me so much that they get compared to each other all the time, and people calls Royal to Kingdom 2 a copy. I'm just really upset at Royale community. I really am. No wonder I stopped playing Royale.